shows the sub-assembly for the compressor section on G turbochargers. The first part of assembly is to take a roll pin and insert this roll pin into the hole at the bottom of the compressor bearing support. Once the pin is flush with the bottom of the slot in the support, stake the pin in location with at least 3 stakes. Next, lift the bearing support slightly and apply lifting eyes in the cradle flange. These lifting eyes are used to lift and move the bearing support to the assembly table. Once the support is on the assembly table, apply a backing plate to the seal bore. This plate makes the bore heat up quicker when the heat lamp is applied. At this point, 2 dowel pins located in the bearing support can be removed. These were placed in during doweling. Be sure to inspect the dowels to make sure that the size is proper for the support and for the main housing. Lower the support assembly onto the table. File all mating surfaces to remove any burrs or nicks that may cause problems in later assembly. All oil passages must be brushed out to ensure cleanliness. Any dirt in these passages could cause bearing damage or turbocharger failure. Once these passages are brushed clean, they must also be blown clean with compressed air. This will remove any loose particles that may be left by the brush. There is a small dowel pin that must be installed near the compressor bearing bore. Start the pin with a ball peen hammer. Using a height gauge, the pin can be completely located to the proper height. Once this is done, the inspector is called over to check the height on the pin. The inspector also checks all the oil passages for cleanliness. Once inspection is complete, a heat lamp can be placed on the bearing support over the bearing bore. There are 2 pipe plugs on the side of the support which must be installed. Use a thread sealant on these plugs. However, do not torque these plugs at this time. Torquing of these plugs now may cause cracking of the support. The third remaining oil hole is to be covered with tape. The plug for this is applied later on at turbo test. Install snap rings on the two dowels which were removed earlier. These snap rings prevent the dowels from sliding too far into the support or main housing. Insert the dowel into the support up to the snap ring groove. Be sure not to pound too hard or the dowel will pass the snap ring and cause damage to the ring and dowel. At this point, the fixture for turning over the bearing support can be applied. Depending if the bearing support was recently removed from the wash or if it is completely cold, the length of time that the heat lamp requires to heat the bore will vary. The air scroll, which also came with the bearing support, should be prepared too. File all the mating surfaces to remove nicks and burrs. Remove the dowels from the air scroll. Install snap rings and the dowels back into the air scroll from the other side. The air scroll can be inverted and placed on a stand for later use. A third lifting eye is inserted into the impeller cover mounting bolt holes to facilitate lifting the air scroll later. Remove a compressor bearing from the wash tank, wipe the bearing clean, inspect the bearing for any burrs or damage, then place the bearing in the freezer on dry ice. The bearing must be on the dry ice and left in the freezer for at least a half hour to ensure that the bearing reaches the proper temperature for installation. The impeller seal has a drilled air passage through the side. The top part of this passage must be plugged with a pin prior to assembly. Using a ball peen hammer, drive the pin into the hole. The compressor seal must be removed from packaging Inspect the compressor seal for any damage, and it also has drilled through holes which must be plugged with pipe plugs. The exhaust duct retaining ring can be cleaned at this time. Install a clevis on the top of the compressor bearing support. Note that on the G turbocharger, this clevis has a round drilled hole for the links. It is not the slotted type clevis used on the E turbocharger. Install the links onto the clevis. Locate the links so they are facing straight up and torque the bolt holding the links to the clevis. By now the bearing will have cooled enough in the dry ice and the support should be hot enough. Remove the bearing from the ice. Locate the bearing over the bearing bore. Note that there is a small hole in the spherical part of the bearing which must pass over the pin which was applied earlier. Once the bearing is in the bore, apply the fixture on top of the bearing and allow the bearing to warm up slightly. You can tell when the bearing is warm by noticing that the frost on the bearing will melt from the heat of the support. When the bearing reaches this temperature, using the large rawhide mallet, firmly seat the bearing into the bearing support bore. Once the bearing is seated, it must be inspected with a 2/1000 feeler gauge to make sure that it is seated all the way around. The inspector should be called for this operation. At this point, locator dowels for the compressor seal can be applied to the support. Install the seal gasket. Note that the slot in the seal gasket must fit over the slot in the bearing support. And the compressor seal can now be applied. Note that the slot in the support will line up with the drilled holes in the bearing seal. Tap the seal over the pilot to make sure that it seats evenly. At this point, the exhaust diffuser is applied. The exhaust diffuser only goes on one way, so the proper bolt holes must line up. Obtain the bolts from the bins next to the assembly area. Using a lubricant, lubricate the threads of the bolts prior to application. Torque all of the mounting bolts using a crisscross pattern to ensure even seating of the seal.